I sincerely hope that there's something that you can all take away for the next 2 days and at least have a good think about. You know, I like that saying, I think it might come up on a slide, but I like that saying from Socrates that I can't teach anybody anything, I can only hope to make them think. And isn't that the truth? You know, that we want our children to think about what they're doing in that wonderful age of metacognition where we know why we're employing the strategies that we're employing to get better at things. That metacognition, which I think is more on tomorrow's agenda. I like this saying too from Samuel Johnson, because no doubt a lot of what we talk about, you already know, you already have thought about and put into practice. But I think when it comes to good pedagogy, we reinvent the wheel a lot, don't we? For the last few years I've been looking increasingly at some of the great philosophers of music education, people like Pythagoras and Confucius particularly. You know, and they have so much to offer, and of course Aristotle and Rousseau, the list goes on. There's so much wisdom in the past that is applicable to today. So you can take what you already know in that spirit. And that's how I feel about children, even with concepts such as musical practice. They need to hear this message all the time. Once is not enough. You know, the brain doesn't learn anything once. We need multiple repetitions to learn something. And the same goes with these messages about pedagogy. Schools focus so much, when you look at that tripartite model of education, they focus so much on curriculum and assessment. What about the pedagogy? Because that's what makes a difference. It's how you teach it that counts. It's how we get the children to construct their learning. It's how we drive discovery learning. We're not just transmitters of information. That's not what pedagogy is about. That's why part of the world think, well, we don't need teachers anymore. It's all online. Sure, if that's what their concept of education is about. But there's so much more, and we'll be looking at ways to deliver that more metacognitive, self-driven, intrinsic learning approach over the next 2 days. So why is it then? Why is it that some children achieve so much more than others? Because that's the truth, isn't it? Some people achieve more. Very simple, rhetorical statement. Why? What underpins that? Well, probably a few things we could talk about, but for me, the number one, or certainly right up there, is that word starting with M. Yeah? A few people got in their heads. Anyone want to say what they think it is? Motivation. That's it. Motivation. Motivation, the fuel of human behaviour. Motivation, which creates in us a desire to persist beyond the boundaries of comfort, to overcome obstacles, and to achieve greater than our teachers' belief in us. Potential is very difficult to measure. Greater than our own expectations, right? Motivation gets results and can achieve enormous things. Not that this person's having much success. So, some questions. How do you motivate your students? I'm going to ask you to have a chat in small, with your neighbours, groups of 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever you feel comfortable with in a moment. You might reflect on what motivates you. Mind you, there'll be different contexts, of course. You've probably got food on the table for children. They don't have some of those external worries. You might go back a step. Can you motivate? Can you really know that it was you that motivated this child's action? So how do you motivate? Why don't we take a few minutes? And by the way, feel free to interject and comment any time you like over these next days. Okay, so small groups. How do you motivate? Is it foremost in your mind? Is it one of your own arguments? We'll talk a lot more about it, I'm aware of that. It is an overarching concern for educators and parents is motivation. So, what do people talk about? I'd like to share an idea that they said or heard. Yeah?
I think your own motivation that radiates at how motivated are you to do what I'm going to do now? How do you project that to the children when they come into your classroom?
So you think personal passion is inspiring?
That's the model there. Yes, they're very
and modelling your enthusiasm?
Exactly. You said, sit in the car because we're going to.
Right. So you radiate that excitement. Who mentioned something similar?
Just extending that, I think the personality of the person, if they're a boring person, you're going to find it hard to motivate other people. So they've got to have exuberance and vitality and a passion for what they're teaching.
So there's an energy factor as well. You've got a handout about choirs, one of my handouts, and I think point number 1, top 10 tips for conductors is energy. You've got to have more energy than the kids. Yeah? So maybe similarly. Someone once said too, there might be a grain of truth in it, musicianship is caught, not taught. Maybe a bit more than that, but there's an element of truth there, isn't there? So passion. Yeah. And that's it, Laura. These are principles that are across domain. Okay, a lot of this is about learning psychology. It's not just applicable to our music context; it's applicable to our family context as well, and our life context. So, so there's lots of possibilities for value here. Tanya, did you have?
Yeah, we were talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic, like handing out stickers and binoculars and saying you can play the drum and all those sorts of things. And then how do you transfer that to intrinsic motivation where they realise that it's something they actually really want to do on their own and it's good for them and it makes them feel good and that they are learning and they're motivated by something inside them and not by the stickers, the drum and tasers.
So you've recognised, one could say, a dichotomy in motivation theory. There is a dichotomy, isn't there? The extrinsic and intrinsic. But are you implying that perhaps there's a place for extrinsic, but the goal is to generate intrinsic interest in what children do? Is that the point?
Lydia pointed out that sometimes you might initially use that to get them on the road, to get them to figure out what this is like, and then from there they might go, oh wow, this is fantastic, and then the intrinsic steps in and brings them further.
Right. That's interesting. Because some types of extrinsic motivators have a bad name, don't they? I think we're really referring to the contingent rewards. If you do this, I'll give you that. But it's not always, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in due course, but it's not all black and white motivation theory, is it? And you might have heard of Csikszentmihalyi, those of you who are familiar with flow theory, which we'll look at later as well. And he says that whilst one must be cautious with extrinsic rewards, there are certain activities, and he mentions, he's not a music writer, he's a psychologist, but he mentions, for example, 3-year-olds playing the violin might not discover that intrinsic beauty of what they're doing, and they might need a little extra incentive just to get to that threshold where it might take root in their heart. So there may be a place for that. There's also some downsides of too much extrinsic motivation, isn't there, or those contingent ones. What do we know about contingent motivators? Well, once you take away the reward, there's diminished attraction of the activity for its own. Right? It's very hard to go backwards from that too. Daniel Pink, the author, says once you pay your kid to take out the rubbish, they'll never do it for free again, right? So be very careful before you go down that road. Yeah. Mike?
Looking at the background of the people, the students that you're teaching, so understanding, actually making an effort to understand where they're coming from, so that when you do try and present an idea, that you're presenting it in context.
Absolutely, and that taps into, when we look at a model in a moment of intrinsic motivation, that really taps in nicely to that, because there's two things that you refer to in that comment and understanding the child, and one is their interests and autonomy, being personally having some volition, hey, I want to do this, that's a big intrinsic motivator, knowing where they're coming from. And the second thing is knowing how to pitch the difficulty of activities. If something's too hard, if people think they can't do it, they give up very quickly. Us adults as well, this is not just kids, right? It's got to be achievable. And that's, I just mentioned flow theory, that's where flow theory is just a beautiful, simple model about pitching, which is something, incidentally, that computer games do incredibly successfully, is they know how to lock the child into their maximising their skill set for the flow zone to occur and take them incrementally forward. So if we can drive that in our music lessons, there's a very good chance that, or greater probability that intrinsic motivation will take root. Someone else?
Seeing the end result.
End
If the
result?
students can see where, if they do this work, this is where they can achieve or further, like what they see, where it's going.
Is that like a goal, Laura?
Yeah. Or-
Okay, did anyone else mention goals?
Yeah.
Yeah, goals. All right, well, let's start with goals, because that's the next slide. I like you. Goals are motivational, and I don't know about you, but when I take a choir session at the beginning of a school year, one of the very first things I do is say, okay, we've got a performance on March the 3rd, or whatever it is. I let them know in advance. Performance is a goal. What are we doing this for, sir? Well, hey, we've got a performance. And that's a grand goal, because children love performing for their parents or for their teachers or other schools or whatever it is. It's a great goal. So having a goal. For some, exams are a goal. What do we know about the ABRSM type, AMEB type examinations? We know that children practice more before an exam. Goals fuel work. Okay? And I often give talks in mainly UK schools at the moment on the nature of work and expertise, and ask children if they have goals, and hey, you know, do you want to be an expert? What are your goals in life? And that is in itself motivational, because if we link the fact that there are certain opportunities in life, there are certain experiences in life, there are certain jobs in life that only experts get invited to, kids understand that. They know that it is a competitive world. That's not going to change. The people who are best at what they do, the chances are they'll get those wonderful opportunities. So do you want a memorable life in that sense? Now, we're not saying that's the only way to have a satisfying life. I'm not saying that at all. But kids relate to this, don't they? They relate to this goal-driven, hey, I want to do that. I want to be a star football player, or whatever their goal is. Another question I often ask students is based on this Harvard University study. So, you know, hey kids, who's got goals in mind for their future? Be it leisure activity type goals or work-related goals. Because I think we need to educate for life, not just about the work life, but about living life, and using our precious leisure time, because we know that most of the world devotes their leisure time to passive leisure activities, like watching TV, which is still the most common and popular way of using leisure time. So I differentiate the types of goals in that sense. And kids, some kids put their hand up. Hey, who writes their goals down? Actually writes them on a piece of paper. Does anyone here do that? Write them down. Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, many don't. Now this is a replication of what Harvard did. It was a long time ago now, in the late 70s, with the business school. They asked their cohort of undergrads the same question. Now Harvard University Business School, yeah, it was all about money. So what they were finding out was, what's their earning capacity 10 years later? And what they found was that those who had goals generally in mind were earning twice as much as those who didn't. And those who wrote down their goals were earning 10 times as much as the others. The power of goals. Goals keep our mind focused. I have a performance coming up in 3 weeks' time. Goals keep our mind focused. Goals fuel that motivation. It is an extrinsic motivator, but not all extrinsic motivators are bad, because it becomes infused with what we're doing. It becomes one with ourself. Whereas if you get an A for your maths, I'll give you $20. That's completely extrinsic. That's a contingent. This is not. So there's different types of extrinsic motivators. So we know about setting goals. You've got to be careful setting goals. They've got to be attainable. You know, this might sound a little coarse, but one reason people have lower self-esteem is they fail a lot. One reason people fail a lot is they don't know how to set realistic goals. Yeah? So, gee, I want to learn Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata in 2 weeks. Well, Michael, you've never come close to learning something of that complexity in 2 weeks. You're setting yourself up for failure. Why don't you enjoy the process of incremental improvement? It's a lot of fun, it gives us a lot of satisfaction, and feeds our self-esteem as well. They call these SMART goals. It's got to be specific. We know, and may I preface, what we talk about, I'll let you know if it's my opinion, otherwise it's research-based what we talk about the next 2 days. We know that the more specific the goal is, the greater the probability that people achieve it. I want to be great at music. Well, Michael, that's just a pretty broad field, and good luck, son, because it's probably not going to happen. Right? I want to master the exposition of that Mozart sonata and give myself 2 weeks to do it. Yeah, okay, that's more attainable. I think I can achieve that. Mindset's very important, isn't it? People give up very easily if they think they can't do something. Think of your own activities. Attainable, relevant, that's that autonomy, and Mike sort of touched on it with getting to know the child and their interest and their context, where they're coming from, and trying to help them. And that's where, as you said, Yvette, if people can catch the interest through us too, wow, gee, my teacher gets so much joy out of this activity, maybe it's worth doing. You know, as teachers, we do sell rationale for our subject areas, don't we? We do say, we do pull them along that bridge. Hey kids, this is a really worthwhile pursuit. And we use tools. I often tell the kids, students about the deathbed studies. You know, when people are at that end of their life, opposite to where you are, children, in their 80s and 90s, these studies have them reflect on, hey, how do you wish you spent your time if you had your time over again? How would you do it differently? And what are the most common responses? I wish I kept learning an instrument. Right. I wish I joined a choir. I wish I wrote that book that was inside me. I wish I took up scuba diving. They're active pursuits. I wish I watched more TV. It never gets a mention. So we do our best to sell, don't we? Say, kids, you'll regret it. I often, and to get them experience it personally, you know, like Confucius said, let them experience it. And, I say, children, who knows an adult who wishes they didn't give up music? Hands go up. They know this stuff. So get it in the forefront of their mind as a reminder, continual reminders. So measurable is about feedback. Feedback is essential in learning progress, isn't it? Feedback is essential. What do we know about feedback? It needs to be quick. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be consistent. The only thing I'd say about that is, before we give them feedback, I'd say, well, what do you think? Because at Bloom's taxonomy, higher order thinking skills, self-evaluation's right up there. You know, we don't want to be at the mercy of having to go to a teacher every time to evaluate where we're at. You've got to learn how to learn. You've got to learn how to evaluate yourself. So hey, what do you think? And we'll talk about that a bit with metacognition tomorrow, because I remember so clearly when I was a boy, I had a fairly lovely guy, but a fairly controlling teacher who I just had to sit there and didn't have to do much, and he'd say, we'll play this and play that, yes, that's good, that's bad, and I was the receptacle of his wisdom, you know. How can we change that and bring the children along with questions like, well, what do you think? What do you think was good and what needs a bit of work? Different ways to teach. Attainable, we'll talk about flow later, and of course that autonomy. So you're hoping, Yvette, from what you said, that at the end of the day, and Tanya also, that children will find an internal sense of motivation. Which is, who's this? Who's this great Greek philosopher? Socrates? Plato? Aristotle? Yeah, Aristotle. And this is, you know, motivation has to get down to a base axiom somewhere, doesn't it? You know, like the base desires of we need food and comfort and companionship and so forth, and as he says, human beings seek self-esteem. We want to feel good about who we are, and happiness more than anything else. And that's the essence of that bottom line of intrinsic motivation. And when we look at extrinsic and intrinsic, which we've been doing, every study suggests that intrinsic motivation leads to high quality learning, deeper learning, more enjoyable learning, greater memory and recall, which is the principal precept of intelligence. You can't remember anything, you can't be considered smart, right? So intrinsic motivation is a great driver. So my question would be, okay, well that sounds terrific. What is it, and how can we teach with this in mind? How can we foster the conditions to take root? Because at the end of the day, my thoughts are, you can fire arrows of inspiration and all sorts of things, but you can't force anyone to learn. You can't really 100%, I'm going to motivate you, and that's it. Agree? Okay, I'm sorry, buddy. You're going to be motivated, you'll like it or not. You can't do that. You know, Socrates, I can only hope to make them think. Learning is a personal acquisition. These guys, Daichi and Ryan, they are the world experts on motivation theory. And I say that because they're cited, Google citation, they're cited more than any other psychologists in the world. And they're part of that wonderful Rochester University. That's where the Eastman School of Music is, one of America's great music schools. Mr. George Eastman set up, Kodak man. Wonderful place. So, so how? Now, what I like about their model, is it's easy, it's simple to understand. And remember Einstein said, concepts are all the greater when they converge towards simplicity, not complexity. Anyone can make things sound harder than they need to be. And these guys distill intrinsic motivation into a simple little tripartite model. They call it self-determination theory. It just means intrinsic motivation for self-determined behaviour. I want to do this, which is autonomy, personal volition. Having some personal control. Now, yes, that's related to choice, but it doesn't mean let the kids do whatever they want. We know that's folly. For example, you take repertoire. Children are not very good at choosing the level of repertoire they need to continue making progress, right? They're not good at that. So we give choice where possible. Hey, here's 6 pieces. Which one do you like? You can choose. And we know what they're the right level. So it's got to be smart about it. It's not just willy-nilly, of course. Relatedness. We're not going to talk much about relatedness. It's something that we all at least intrinsically understand, though, that children who experience their teachers as being cold and uncaring experience lower levels of intrinsic motivation. Okay, so there needs to be a warmth there of some sort. Not too much, though. Apparently, children need to know that we care about them, we respect them, and we like them. If they think we don't like them, well, you know how that works. It doesn't work good at all. Right. So relationship is very important. I care about you, I respect or value you, and I like you. They don't need warm fuzzies above that. Right. In fact, you've got to be careful with warm fuzzies above that, because even if they can't explain it, children can differentiate between supportive care and concern and coercive care and concern, and they get a bit suspicious if they think it's sycophantic. So, yeah. And competence. Competence is the first major one we're going to talk about now for the rest of the session, and part of the next session as well. It'll go as long as it goes because it's that important. So, a professor of music in Western Australia, his concern was all these children doing immersion programs in strings in grade 3 or 4 and band instruments in grade 5 and 6 and what have you in schools in Perth. The retention rate was not high. Why are so many children giving up music, particularly in those difficult middle years ages of grade 6, 7, 8 and 9? Now, he got a response from the children, one word. Why aren't you doing music? What do you think they said? Boring. That's it. It's boring. Now, as a teacher, it hurts when someone tells us that our subject area is boring, doesn't it? He found that wasn't what they meant at all. They couched it in that language as a self-protection mechanism. No, my mates and I find this boring. It's a protection system. And fair enough, because we know that the word boring does not relate to music learning. It might be difficult, but it's not boring because if anything, there's too much for the mind to pay attention to, isn't there? It's too much. You have to jump and break it down. It's too much. It's not boring. So what he found was the real issue that they're giving up music, fragile competence beliefs. Fragile competence beliefs. They thought they were going to fail in the sense that they did not believe they had the capacity to get any good at it, to make progress. That's why. And they use this other language, protect. They don't try anymore. That's another protection mechanism. You know, not trying. And of course, they are the students who weren't practicing. Okay, so.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah.
So, how did they arrive at their own assessment of their own competence? Like, I'm doing this music lesson, but the underlying feeling was I'm not going to get anywhere. Is that the...
Yeah, I'm not making progress. Yeah, and I guess, Mike, they're going to their band lesson with the they can't play. They can't play.
Right.
They're behind other members of the group, and of course, what's driving that is they're not practicing. But that's really a secondary issue. Yeah, there's that as well. Okay, so that leads to that question, of course, what is the greatest motivator? And it's a word we've already mentioned here recently, because it's so important in music and in everything. Teresa Amabile is a professor at Harvard University, economics. She does a lot of studies on motivation in all sorts of contexts, not just business workplaces. She suspected that the number one motivator would be recognition. People love to be recognised. It's not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. It's a self-esteem issue. That goes back to Aristotle. People feel good about who they are. But it wasn't. There was one greater motivator. Starting with P. Progress. Simple, isn't it? Progress is the great motivator. And just like Dr. Jeff Lowe found out, if people don't make progress, they're going to give up. And I think, even though that's one of these messages that we all know this, it's worth keeping that in mind. If children don't make progress, they're going to stop learning. They're going to give up. I'm no good at this. I'm not getting any better. So, let's continue the line. How do you make progress as a music learner? Rhetorical questions galore here, folks. You practice. Okay. So, my pitch and a statement that I bandy around, and I've had students at my last school, they get a bonus mark at the end of the test just for, complete the sentence. They say, oh, it's this one again. The greatest predictor of musical progress is, so I go on about this all the time because it's true, isn't it? If you want to get better at music, it's about the quality and the quantity of your practice time. And in a moment, we're going to have another opportunity for discussion in small groups about what does quality practice look like. Forget the quantity for now, and that differs a lot, doesn't it? What does quality practice look like? But secondly, how do you teach it? Do you teach it? I've known lots of teachers, and well-meaning teachers, but they sort of assumed that, like I was told, now Michael, you need to practice more. Well, okay. How? Because Gary McPherson, another professor of music, and this one's in Melbourne, Australia, used to be head of ISMO, International Society for Music Education. I've read lots of his studies, they're really worth looking at, about this topic. And he said 80% of children under the age of 14, the way they practice is they go from the start of the piece to the end of the piece once without stopping to fix anything. Without quality practice? No. Do you make progress? No. What's going to happen? They'll probably give up.